All right. Can everyone see my screen? Can you, like, thumbs up? Okay. All right, so it's 6:40, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's lecture. So we're gonna do an introduction to React. All right. So you've seen this diagram many times probably. So we've done the HTML, which is like the static markup for a website. And then we did CSS, which like made the page pretty and everything. And finally, we went through JavaScript, which actually added some functionality to websites. So now we are putting this all together into this one framework, which we call React. And this is like the foundations of front-end development. And so now that you know React, once you know React, you'll be able to build websites like this. Today, we're actually going to do a demo on Tic-Tac-Toe. It's not going to look as pretty as this, but you'll actually learn how to make a website that plays the game Tic-Tac-Toe, which will be super cool. All right, so let's get started with our introduction to React. So firstly, what is React? So React is a JavaScript library, and it's used for building user interfaces. So the way React works is the code is like structured into a bunch of components, and through those components, you can make UI elements for web pages. And these are like little building blocks, and at the end of it, you'll have a full web application working with React. And so why do we want to use frameworks and libraries? Because it makes your life easier, long story short. So like imagine you have experience with JavaScript now, but like imagine making like Instagram with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and think about how complicated it would be to make an application like Instagram or like Facebook or any of those like social media platforms. It would take a lot of work, like so many lines of code, so many files, like so much custom CSS, like everything would be extremely hard. But with a framework like React, it makes things a lot simpler. The development is faster, and overall, your application is a lot more scalable. I don't think it says here on the slide, but React is also a very good has like a very good testing framework. So if you're trying to build like applications that will go into production, most people will use React because there's a testing framework for that as well. Yeah. So like here is like a picture of like just like a little icon section. And this is just to show like there's so many little elements on the page, and building that in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript would be extremely complicated. But with React, since the code is structured into components, it's much easier to structure your code out. And building this would take so much less time, effort, and lines. Yeah, so those are the reasons why we use React. Yeah, and React in general is industry standard when it comes to like front-end frameworks. There are other ones like Vue, Angular, but React is by far the most popular and the one used in the industry the most. Yeah, and yeah, these are some of the other reasons that we like using React. I won't spend too much time on it. All right, so let's get started with actually doing React coding. All right. I'm not sure if you guys have already downloaded Node and NPM yet, but if you haven't, then go to nodejs.org and follow the instructions for downloading. And once it's downloaded, run these two commands, node-v and npm-v, and you should see something outputting. And if it's something outputs, then that means it's downloaded. So I'll give like 1 or 2 minutes for everyone to do that. I'm going to turn off this now. Oh. Also, while people are doing that, if you have any questions, feel free to like unmute and ask or leave them in the chat and I can answer some while people are. Is React translated to JavaScript eventually? So I'm assuming you mean on runtime. I will kind of, when we start with the demo, I'll show how it works a little bit. So React uses JSX, which is not quite JavaScript, but very similar. So on compile time, I'm pretty sure Node is used to compile it. But I'll show you how it works when we go into like create React app. Okay. Are people good for me to move on? Okay, I'm just going to take the silence as a yes. So before we get into it, I'll just like run over a couple tools that we generally use when working with React. The first one is Prettier, which is like a code formatter. So I think you can download a Prettier extension on VS Code, and then that will help you format your code when you're writing it. So it's kind of like a necessity at this point because like it helps with the indentation, making sure things are readable and clean. So yeah, I would highly recommend downloading it and then following these two instructions. I can show how that works also. Okay. The other thing is ESLint. And this is just like another library that enforces like code style. So you usually enable it ESLint in your projects, and like it basically outlines a whole bunch of rules that developers need to follow when writing React code. And so then you'll get like ESLint errors if you break one of those rules, but it's enforced by the ESLint itself, not by React. So you would need to have ESLint enabled to like have it actually enforce some rules on your code. Yeah, so this is another thing that is generally used industry-wide because everyone has different styles of coding and we want to make sure it's like all the same, especially when it comes to like code reviews and stuff. All right. So for this part, I'm just going to kind of run through a demo. So let me know if you can't see my terminal, or you need me to make the font bigger. But I'm going to start by running npx create react app. I'll just call it a demo. You can open up a terminal and do this, and make sure to cd into whatever folder you want this React app to run in. And this will take like a couple minutes to run. So basically what npx create react app does is it it just creates like a React app with a whole bunch of dependencies that you would need to run this app. So that's why it's going to take a really long time, because these are all the dependencies that are installing. And yeah. All right. Yeah, you can see it added like 1,400 packages into this one project. So React has a lot of like frameworks and packages running in the background, and that is what makes it all work. So that is what NPM is for. It's NPM stands for Node Package Manager. And so instead of like the developers having to like handle all of, like the dependencies on their own, Node Package Manager just makes it easier for you to create a React app with all the dependencies that you would need. Another one that is pretty popular is Yarn, which we also use, but for now, I'm just going to use NPM. So mine is done running. Yours might take a little while. Also, if this is your first time doing it, you might have to like install it npx for the first time. Just go ahead and say yes to that. And then you'll see here that my folder demo, which was like my argument from Create React App, it shows up in this, like in my home directory. So I'm going to cd into that. And then actually, all right. And then you'll see it already created like a whole directory. So there's like the source folder, public folder, package.json, and I will run through each of these things very quickly. So I'm going to open this in VS Code. And you can go ahead and do that too. All right. Okay. So I'm going to quickly talk about all the files in this like Create React App folder, essentially. So what exactly is this creating? So I'll start off with the Node modules, I guess. So like Node is basically what is used to like run the JavaScript code. And so you'll see there's a whole bunch of modules and packages that are needed that are downloaded from Create React App. There's a whole bunch. There's no need to go into them too in depth, but yeah, this is what was installing when Create React App was running. The public folder, it just has like some static, basically the public folder is for like static assets for your web pages. So like the HTML file, images, maybe some like text files, JSON files, stuff like that. And also CSS. So if we look here, you can see like this is essentially like the web page that will show up when your React app is running. And let me quickly show you how to run a React app. So I'm just going to open the terminal and I'm CD'd into my root folder, which is called demo. And I'm just going to run npm start. And this, what it's going to do is start this React app on a local server. Open it somewhere. Yeah, it's going to take a little bit. Yeah, and see, this is our React page, which is now running on my localhost 3000. And you can see like in the head, for example, you have a bunch of metadata. So like if you see here, you can, it's called React app, and that ties directly back into the metadata from the HTML file, the index.html. But the real crux of a React app is actually in source. So source is basically where all the development will happen. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. But the main thing is app. So as you can see, like if you look at the app versus the page itself, you see like an image and that has the React logo. There's a link that says Learn React, and that's this link right here. There's this p tag, which corresponds to this. So your web page is actually being built in Source. Let me see something in chat. Oh, do you mean the npx create React app? Let me. So it's called this. So, and then you would want to put like your application name as the argument. So npx create -react -app and then the name of the folder. All right. Are there any other questions? Oh, where I opened the local server. Oh, okay. So you open a terminal. I can open a new terminal. And you want to make sure you're in the directory that of your React app. So mine is called demo, yours can be called like something else, lecture 7, not really sure. And then all you want to do is run npm start, and that will start it. Npm start, enter, and that should run. Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. The other thing I wanted to point out is your app is actually being rendered in the index.js file. And this line right here is how you correspond your index.js to your index.html. So you can see in the body, there's this div, which has ID of root, and that directly corresponds to this. So React DOM.create root, and it's getting the element from that HTML file, and it's rendering your app, which is your entire React app. So that's kind of how everything ties together in a React app. So for example, like I change this to, I don't know, something like that, and saved, then you'll see there's nothing on my page anymore because the JS file isn't getting the right element anymore. It's not getting the right ID. But if I changed it here, now it's back. And quickly, the last thing I wanted to show in terms of like the way things are laid out is the package.json, which kind of contains all, oh, there's a question. You're getting an npm error when trying to run the create. What is the error exactly? Do you make sure you have npm installed and that you're spelling things correct? It's npx create React app. That's the command. I'll send it in chat. Okay, so if it's saying create React app requires node 14 or higher, then you need to update your Node.js. So try updating Node and then running it again. Okay, how do you open it in VS Code? So in VS Code, you can just do file, open, and then like navigate to where you put the file. So make sure you put it in a directory that you can find. Okay. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to go over is package.json really quickly. So this has some of your like dependencies that you would need. So like testing dependencies, like for example, Jest, which is like React's testing framework, or like if you're using like Chakra UI, which is a styling framework, then you'd also put that in your dependencies. So these are like dependencies that you'd need for development specifically. and like specific packages that you would want to add into your React app. And for scripts, so like, for example, start. When I run npm start, I would actually be running this script right here, which is actually React scripts start. So you can make a whole bunch of scripts depending on what you want to run. So like if I wanted to test, then I would run npm test, and that would run specific unit tests that I made for my React app. The rest is not too important, but potentially you might, they're all lookupable. So the ones that we're going to focus on today are like dependencies and scripts. Everything else, not too important. Yeah, you can try calling React script start or npm React script start. It's one of those two, and that would basically be the same as npm start. Oh, very interesting. I'm not quite sure what to do with that error. You can try looking it up on Google. I'm sure someone on Stack Overflow has run into a specific error like that. I would try running it. I would try looking it up. Okay. So that's all I wanted to cover for the file structure. Are there any questions before I move on? Okay. If not, I'm going to move on. Okay. Oh, let me see something in chat. What's the point of Prettier? The point of Prettier is to format your code. So like say you're copying, pasting something, or like two people who are working on a project have completely different styles. Prettier like will format it so that everything is in one uniform like code style, like in terms of like indentations or like the way things are spaced. That's what Prettier is for. It's just to make things more readable. Okay. All right. So I'm going to give just a very quick intro to JSX, and I'm going to use this specific app. So I'm going to go ahead and delete everything from this and save. The nice thing about React is it auto compiles your code. So every time you save, you'll see errors and it'll automatically refresh. So now that I deleted everything from app, there's nothing on the page anymore. So if I created like a paragraph tag and wrote hello in there, it shows up on my page like that. So React uses JSX. And basically what JSX is a way for you to inject JavaScript code into your HTML. So like you can see here, like this is all HTML, right? But within this function, I can define some variables. So like const x equals 5. And then I can make another p tag and display this. So I could display 5 like this, and obviously it would work because it's running it's like HTML. But if I use the curly braces to indicate that this is a JavaScript variable and I input x into there, then the number 5 will still show up. So that is JSX. And that's kind of a simple example. Let me show you something slightly more complicated. Another thing that is useful with JSX is that I can run like specific JavaScript array functions. So I'm going to create an array called items, and I'm just going to put the letters A, B, C, just like that. So JavaScript specifically has a map function for arrays. So I'm going to render this list of elements as like paragraph tags. So the way you do that is like items.map. Map function takes in another function. And in that, I'm just going to put name item. And in the return, I'll make a paragraph for item. Like that. As you can see, oh, oops, I didn't actually use curly braces. So this is basically calling this variable, which I passed into my arrow function. And now it should render each element separately in the new line. So instead of like having to do 3 separate lines, like A, B, and C, I can just make 1 line of code and render out a whole list just like that. And this is very useful for rendering like a list of components in one shot, just like that. So yeah, these are very simple examples of JSX, but in general, all you have to remember is that JSX is just JavaScript inserted into your HTML. So that's what makes React so powerful, is that it's kind of combining HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into one framework. You don't really have to deal with having separate files. Okay, are there any questions? Okay, let's see a couple. It's called JSX, so JSX, like that. I sent it in chat. Okay, if there are no other questions, I'm going to move on to the rest of this demo. All right, and for that, I'm going to need you guys to go to this URL. I'm going to paste it in chat. Sorry, there was a question. Is class name equals app required? No, it's not. So you can see up at the top of app.js, it's importing app.css. And in that file, you can see like this is the CSS file, and all it's doing, all the this class app is doing is like center aligning the text. So if I just like take that out, everything is now like left aligned. There's no need for a class name, but obviously if you want to enforce some styles, then yeah, you would need to use that. But specifically class name equals app, not required, but any other class name you could use. So I pasted the link. Oh. But returning an HTML element that contains everything is required. Can you expand on what you mean by that? Do you mean like this line over here? Okay. So what this is doing is it's grabbing the HTML element root from this file, from HTML. So it's grabbing this div. And then here in this line, it's like injecting all our code from app into that div. So that's what root.render is doing. So yes, you would need this line. Otherwise, nothing will show up on your page. Okay. For everyone else, when you go to that link, basically that is the repo for the starter code for today's demo. The only thing in there is like a couple like empty. There's so we're gonna be doing like tic-tac-toe in this demo. I just wanted to make some starter code for the CSS specifically. So go ahead and clone that to your local machines. We don't need to work with our create React app that we just made. We're gonna work with the starter code. And that's this right here. All right, everyone can still see both my VS Code and Chrome, right? Okay. All right. Am I good to move on? I'm just going to take that as a yes. I'm going to move on. All right. So I am going to quickly start a local server for this. So I'm going to run npm start. Hopefully that opens here. Sometimes it just automatically opens. Okay. So everyone, if you run npm start, you should see something like this, a grid with 9 squares and then text that says next player X. And if you try and like click around and do some stuff with it, nothing's going to happen because our React app has no functionality. Okay. So I quickly wanted to make a call out for like the file structure in general. So React apps are structured into components. So as you can see here, I made a separate folder for all my components. Everything could technically be done in like app.js or even index.js, but to make code like more readable and cleaner, I separated each of these components into files. So we have the smallest, like we go from like child up. So square is a child of board. And then board is a child of game. And then finally in app, you see that game is the child of app. So it's kind of like this hierarchical structure from parent to child. And that is generally, that's like how all React apps are structured. The other thing I wanted to make note of is the syntax we use to create components. So components are like JavaScript functions, essentially. So I'm using this function. I'm creating a function called squares. I don't think this, right now it doesn't take anything. And then it's returning just like a button. And then finally, I'm exporting it like this. So to export any of the components that you make, you want to make sure to include this line at the bottom, export default, and then the name of your component. And this has to be the same as the name of your function. And as you can see here in board, I import square from that file. How did I launch the host? Run npm start. So make sure to cd into the folder, the correct folder. It's called lecture 7 demo, right? So cd into that and then run npm start. Yeah. It might tell you that it'll go to like localhost 3001 because you haven't closed the server for the other app we just made. It really doesn't matter the number, the host. All right. So let's get started with actually making this tic-tac-toe work. So as you can see, these squares have like nothing in them. So the first thing that I want to do is let's just display the number inside the square. And how will I do that? I'm going to use something called props. So props are essentially like they're like function arguments for React components. So I would pass a prop, I'm going to call it value, and that will be I, which is from the function arguments here. And then to call it in square, I'm going to make sure that I include props in like the function signature. And then I'll call props like this. So the way you want to make sure that like the name of this corresponds to the name that you put when you like called the React component. So I called it value in board. So in square, I'm going to say props dot value. And so if I save both of them, now you see each number inside of the squares. Another thing I quickly want to mention is that props are JavaScript objects. So I can destructure the object out, and I can specifically say I want just value from props because that's the only prop that Square has. And I can delete this props dot and just say just render value, and nothing should change. So if you only have like one or two props, you can like destructure it like this, like value 1. If I had like a value 1, something like that. But if you have multiple, then just stick with the name props. Are there any questions on props? No? Okay. I'm going to move on then. Oh, there it is. Can I clarify how props work? Okay, sure. So props, to reiterate, they're like function arguments. So I can pass in values from the parent component board, for example. And like these are like arguments that Square can use to render out. So like in board, I pass in value like this, and I set it equal to something. I can make another prop too, like value 1, and make that the string hello, for example, something like that. And in here, this is how I kind of tie the two components together. So I can either like take out value or value 1 from the props, and then you'll see like the value that's being rendered changes based on what you're passing in from the parent component. So props are a way to pass data from parent component to child component. And this is like the syntax for doing it. Does that make sense? No, props do not work in the other direction. So I cannot pass props from child up. That's just not how, that's bad practice in React to go from child back up to parent. It only works one direction, which is parent to child. And I'll later in this lecture, I'll talk about how exactly we can pass data from sibling components, so like to child components that have no like direct ties to each other, and also from child back up to parent. But you can't use props to go back in the other direction. All right. Okay, so obviously this is not how tic-tac-toe works. They don't have numbers in the squares. So let's make each square change when you click it. So for right now, I'm just going to make it change the value to X, for example. So when I click on a square, I want it to change to X. So how exactly can I do that? So how about I start like this? I'm going to create an array called squares. Oh, let's spell that. In the way, for right now, I'm just going to say it's null to start out. So I'm going to make an array length 9, and all those values are going to be null to start out with. So in here, I'm going to pass in squares I, like that. Excuse me. Make sure to spell your variables right. So right now we see nothing because obviously every element in this array is null. So this button now needs an onClick function. So I'm going to create another prop for square, and I'm just going to call that onClick. And the type of this prop is actually going to be a function. So in this function, for right now, I'm just going to make it an arrow function. And what it's going to do is set squares I to X, just like that. So what this is saying is that when I click this button, it should set the value in the array to X. And then in squares itself, I will add an onClick to the button. And that will be props.onClick, like that. Okay, so if I click it, nothing's happening. Why isn't nothing happening? I can show, okay, let me inspect here in the console, and I'll show you that the array is actually getting updated. So in this, I'm just gonna add, okay, it's kind of ugly. Bear with me for this. Okay, so see here, I can click it, and you can see in the console, I clicked the first one, and the first value in the array changed. So why isn't it updating on the page? Basically, the short answer for that is, even though the value of the array is changing, React isn't going to re-render the page. The page has already been rendered. So like, even though the array has changed, the page is already rendered. So that means that like nothing will, the display won't be different. So how do I change the display? That's where state hooks come in. So I'm going to delete this for now because this is useless. And I'm going to show you how state hooks work. So the first thing I want to do is I want to import useState from React. And useState is the React hook that we're going to be using to manage the state of our React app. I'm going to delete this one now also. Okay. The way the syntax works is this. So the structure of using useState is this. So the first one is variable. So like the variable you keep track of. And then function to change variable equals useState initial value. I'm going to put this in the comments because this is all kind of gibberish. Okay, so essentially, useState returns an array. And in that array, there's two things. The first is the variable that you're actually changing. And the second is a function that will change that variable. So in our case, we have squares, which is our array. And then I'm going to call the function set squares. And this is kind of like a development syntax. Sorry, I lost the word for it. But we usually, so like in terms of naming variables, this is like the naming convention we use. It's like the variable and then like camel case for like set variable. If that makes sense. But yeah. And then my initial value for squares is going to be this array of 9 items that are null. Okay. So now that I have squares being kept track of using like the useState hook, I'm going to actually call the function. So to do that, I'm actually going to make a new function called handle click, just because there's multiple lines that I'm going to need to handle. So this function takes in the index I, and in that I'm going to create a copy of our squares array. And this is because we're mutating the value before calling set squares. So I can't directly like update the squares array and then call set squares, because React doesn't like you mutating the value that you're going to change. So this is how you create a copy of an array, just like this. And I'm just going to check that squares I is not null. So that's how I'm going to do that. Because if the value has already been changed, then I don't want to change it again. So I'm just going to return. And then finally, I'm going to change the value to X. Then I'm going to call set squares and pass in the new value, the new array. So I updated squares copy, and then you want to pass in the new array into your set squares function. And that's how you're actually going to update the array. Okay. And so in this onClick function, in this prop, I'm actually going to call it just like that. All right, let's see if it works. And there we go. So now I clicked each square and they're changing into X's. Okay, that was a lot. I'm going to pause here for questions. Any questions about useState, state hooks, why we have to use it? What does the syntax mean? Yeah, okay. So this syntax is basically destructuring the unpacking the array that is returned from useState. So useState is returning an array, and it's always going to return an array of 2 items, and it's always going to be in this order, like variable and then function to change variable. And so since it always returns only 2 items, this is how I call it. Is set squares predefined? What do you mean by that? How come the squares, okay. Okay, I'm going to answer this one first. How come the squares are no longer initially rendered from 0 to 9? Do you mean like, why did it become empty when we changed it to this? Okay, okay. So, okay, for the function itself, basically, this function, its purpose is to update the value of this variable. And when React detects that the variable has been updated, it'll re-render the page. I don't know if that answers your question about whether the function itself is predefined. We're defining it technically in terms of creating the name, like initializing it, but the function itself is coming from useState. Yeah. Essentially that. useState is returning a function, and that function is being used to update the variable. Yeah. That's exactly right. Set squares is just assigned to that function that is returned by useState. Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. Then I'm going to move on. Okay, so the next problem we have here is that this file, all it does is change the values in the square to x, but that's obviously not how tic-tac-toe works, right? We have two different players, x and o. So I'm going to create another state variable to handle switching players because obviously it goes in turns. So I'm going to use the useState hook again. This time I'm going to call it is x playing. Set is x playing. All right. The other thing to note about useState is the type is like dynamically set. So whatever you pass in to the useState function, that's going to be the type of this variable. So I passed in array in this call, and in this call, I'm passing in a Boolean. So now, like whenever I use this function, I'm going to make sure that I'm passing the Boolean into that function because that's the type of is x playing. All right, I'm going to set the initial value to true just because x always goes first. All right, and the way I'm going to handle the functionality is in our handle click function. So I'm going to use a one-liner code. It's called a ternary operator. So in my handle click function, I'm going to check that is x is playing. So I'm going to modify this line specifically. So how this syntax works is here, I'm going to say squares copy I equals, and then I'm going to call my Boolean and put a question mark next to it. So what this syntax means is that if this value is true, then it's going to return the first value. If it's false, then it's going to return the second value. So this is called a ternary operator. And this is how the syntax works. It goes Boolean variable, question mark, and then true value, false value, like that. And the last thing I want to do is switch the player, essentially. So let's see if this works. Now we have x, switches to O, x again, O again, and it keeps switching off. But obviously, this text in the bottom is not changing. So I want to also make sure it changes so that we know that the next, like the current player is the one that's clicking. So here for in this variable called status, I'm also going to, I think I can probably run this like this. I'm going to make a, hope this works. All right, okay. So basically this syntax here is called templates, a template string. So instead of using like single quotes or double quotes, I'm going to use these like backticks, which is, it should be near your escape button. It's like in the top row. On Mac, it's like next to the numbers, to the left of the numbers. And then inside is a JavaScript, is a JavaScript code, essentially. So it's going to run this. Did that work? Okay, never mind. That didn't work. Okay, another way I can do it is this. I'm just gonna do that. I'll also just do that. quite sure why this isn't working. Oh, I see. You are right. Nice catch. Nice catch. I'll just divide those two down there. There we go. Thank you so much. And I think it should switch off, as you can see. So like next turn is O, so that means when I click, O will come. All right, thank you so much. You're right. Yeah, you want to make sure like with the scope of JavaScript, if you're using the variable, it has to be defined before you use it, before you call it. Let me see if this actually works. Yeah. Yeah, so you can still inject JavaScript like this ternary operator inside a template string, just like this. Okay. All right. I covered a lot for tic-tac-toe, so are there any questions about anything that I've just done? For the on-click props, does the square receive the on-click event or value? I mean, if square calls the event handler instead of board. Okay. Thank you for asking that question. So I remember there was a question earlier about how to pass data from child back up to parent. And this is kind of how we do it. So the concept itself is called lifting state up. So essentially, the child component is going to take in a function that will modify the variable itself. So you're right that square is calling the function. The square component is calling the handle click function, not board. Board is just passing that function into square. But square is calling a function that is defined in board. And these variables, like this array and this Boolean variable, are both defined in board. So square cannot directly pass that up into board. Therefore, we need to define it in the parent component itself. Then the function will modify the values, if that makes sense. And that is how we kind of handle modifying data from child to component, like child to parent. So yes, square is the one that's calling the function, not board. The prop is just of type function. And then it's triggered when the button is clicked in square. Does that make sense? Okay, sounds good. Are there any other questions? Yeah, so a child can modify parents through function, but not directly their parents' variable, yes. I mean, okay. I mean, how else would a child modify a parent's value without a function, if that makes sense? So yes, it needs the function. Okay. All right. So if there's no other questions about that, then I'm going to move on to the last step of our tic-tac-toe, which is actually figuring out how a winner works, because this game, nothing happens, obviously. O won, but the page isn't telling me that O won. So how exactly do I do that? I'm going to create another function, and I'm going to call that calculate winner. That is also going to take in the index I, which is the index of the square. So calculate winner is going to be called every time you click a button. So we don't want the game to go on forever if we already found a winner, right? So each time you click the button, you have to always be calculating whether someone has won the game. So I am actually just going to go to the decal website because this demo is already in our content. I'm just going to copy and paste. So if you go to lesson 8.5, scroll down. Lesson 8.5 is basically going over the exact same thing that I go over in this. I'm just going to copy and paste this function because there's no need for me to go over the logic of it too much, but essentially these are like the positions of like winners. So like top row, second row, last row, the diagonals, stuff like that. So all it's doing is checking that the value in like these arrays are the same, if that makes sense. So I'm going to give everyone a moment to just copy and paste that in. So if we go to the lecture, like the lesson 8.5, and then you can scroll down close to the bottom and it should have this function somewhere there. Also, while you do that, if there's any other questions, feel free to type them in chat. Yep. Okay. Are we good to move on? Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and move on. The first thing that I want to do is in my handle click function, I want to make sure that a square can't be clicked if we already have a winner. So I'm just going to modify this if statement to include the condition this condition. I think that should work. Okay. So if there's a winner, if this is not null, or if this is not null, then obviously I don't want any squares to click because that means we're done. So that's the first thing that I want to do. Hold on. I think I said this wrong. Calculate winner is actually supposed to take in an array. Excuse me, it takes in an array. Yeah. So it's going to look at the entire array and then compare it based on these lines. Just to make things a little bit neater, I'll just define a variable called winner. Again. I'm just going to put all these up at the top of the file. Just to make sure we have no more scoping issues. All right, so now that I have this variable, no need to call the function in here. if winner is not null. Okay. That's it for that. All right, so let's see if this works. So I'm gonna click X. Oh, I'm gonna just make X win like incredibly fast. And now you see none of the other buttons are clicking because we have found a winner. All right, but this still saying next player O, right? So I want to change that to say a winner X. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to modify my status variable. First of all, I'm going to put this down here. So right now it's saying next player this. It's going to follow this logic. So I'm going to say there's two different options. So instead of it being a const, I'm going to say let for now and just leave it like that. And then in an if block, if winner is not null, then I want status to say winner. Let me make that a template string, but is winner is the variable. Let me quickly use backtext. Otherwise, if it is null, then I'm gonna say that the status is next player. So now you can see automatically updated. So the winner is X because it has found a winner. So let's see if it works in the case for O. X starts. I'm just gonna make O win very fast. Why did I do that? Okay, and the winner is O. So now we have a fully functioning game of tic-tac-toe, all created using React. And specifically the things we covered to make this work are components, props, and state. And those three things are pretty much all you need to make any React app: components, props, and state. So now that you have the fundamentals, you can start building out React apps. Are there any questions about this last section? Okay, if there are no questions, that is pretty much it for the demo. We now have a fully working tic-tac-toe. Obviously, more styling could be added, but it works. All right. As for announcements, Homework 3 is due October 10th, which is next Monday, I believe. And then Homework 4 will be due next Thursday, October 14th. The website says October 19th. That is false. Check the ed post for the due dates. Okay, we do have a question right here. React mixes JavaScript and HTML. So how can we avoid spaghetti code? Can you elaborate on what spaghetti code is? Something that's hard to read? Okay. So React has a very specific syntax that mixes JavaScript and HTML. So in that sense, when it comes to reading JSX, that's just the syntax of React. But in terms of making sure code is readable, that's where components come into handy, because we obviously don't want all of our code in app.js because that gets incredibly messy very fast. So that is why we split things into components. And another way to make things less messy is obviously to create new files for each of your components. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, and do you know how we can see what's wrong with problems grade scope marks wrong? I thought we changed it so that Gradescope will show the test output. If it doesn't, I'll bring it up and we can change that. All right, I'm going to stop sharing here. We have like 10 more minutes. Are there any other questions? Oh, but if there are no other questions, feel free to leave. That is it for this lecture. We reuse a React component, like add one more game, for example. You mean like have it so that it can keep going forever and ever, like it'll restart? Oh, 2 games going on in the browser. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you can definitely do that. That is the point of React components, is to make that like the code more reusable. So that's why we like separate out our code. So I think have 2 games going on in the browser, you just have to call game twice. You can try doing that in app, like render game twice. And I think you'll see 2 separate boards happening.
Okay, I have one more question, but it's not related to the lesson today. It's related to the last lesson. Is that okay?
Yeah, go
Yeah.
for it.
Can I share my screen? Yeah.
1 second.
Yeah.
Yes, you can share your screen.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it.